There are numbers that no longer belong to a person. They belong to a silence. You still know it by heart, not because you wanted to, but because grief has a way of carving repetition into the nervous system until it feels like instinct. Your fingers move before your mind agrees. The screen lights up. The digits appear, one by one. Familiar, small, harmless, ordinary. And yet, every time you press them, it feels like placing your hand against a sealed door and hoping, with a kind of shameful devotion, that the dead might still be on the other side, listening. The call does not connect. It never does, but you call anyway. That is the part nobody tells you about loss. People think the absence arrives like a storm, loud and violent, all at once. It does not. Most of the time, it arrives in quieter forms, in a number that rings once and then falls into the void, in a contact name that remains in your phone long after the voice has left the world, in the tiny green icon that looks so alive, so functional, so meaningless, in the absurd hope that maybe, just maybe, this time there will be an answer, and the universe will apologize for what it has done. You keep the number because deleting it feels like murder, and calling it feels like prayer. So you do neither properly. You hover, right in the middle. That is where grief lives. The first time you call, you still expect a voice, not because you are foolish, but because the brain is a stubborn organ. It keeps old patterns alive long after reality has broken them. It remembers the timing of the reply, the exact second the other person used to answer, the slight breath before they said your name, the way their voice sounded when they were tired or laughing or trying not to let you hear that they were crying. Memory is cruel in this way. It preserves the shape of a person while the world removes the person themselves. So you call, and the ringing sounds wrong, not because the sound has changed, but because the meaning has. A ringing phone used to mean possibility. Now it means distance. And still, you listen. 1 ring, 2, 3. Your heart behaves like it still believes. Then, the machine answers. Not them, never them. The same flat voice, the same sterile message, the same polite architecture of absence. The number is no longer available. The line cannot be completed. Please check the number and try again. As if the mistake is yours. As if grief is a dialing error. As if there is some correct sequence of numbers that could reopen a closed life. You try again anyway, because what else is there? What else does a human do when love has nowhere left to go? Some people visit graves. Some people light candles. Some people fold letters and keep them hidden in drawers. You call a number that no longer answers, and each call becomes a tiny act of defiance, a refusal to let the finality settle too neatly, a refusal to let the world pretend that someone can simply vanish without leaving a fracture in the air. You do not call because you think they will answer. Not really. You call because silence is sometimes heavier when it is shared with a machine. Because a dead number feels less lonely than a dead room. Because hearing the dial tone, the ringing, the failure, is still a form of contact. It is an interface between what was and what no longer can be. A bridge made of nothing,
a ritual built from disappointment. And in a strange way, that makes it sacred. There are nights when the phone screen is the only light in the room. Your hand feels colder than the device. Your thumb pauses above the call button, as if it knows something your mind refuses to say aloud. You stare at the name saved in your contacts, and the letters look smaller than they used to. Less like a person, more like a relic. A label attached to a door that no longer opens.
You remember the last conversation. Or perhaps not the conversation itself, but the shape of it. The unfinished feeling. The smallness of ordinary things spoken before the world became unbearable. You remember how normal they sounded. That may be the hardest part. Not the death, but the normality before it. People imagine final moments as cinematic. They are usually not. Often, they are terribly ordinary. A message left unread, a cup left on a table, a sentence interrupted by the need to go somewhere else, to do something later, to call back in a minute. Later. Later is where most of our tragedies live. Later is the word that looks harmless until it becomes irreversible. And then, one day, later becomes never. The number does not answer, so you begin to speak to the silence itself. Not out loud, always. Sometimes only in the mind. Sometimes with the strange intimacy of someone who has run out of witnesses. You say the things that were never said. The apology that came too late. The thank you that was swallowed by pride. The anger, the shame, the tenderness, the stupid little details, because grief loves details. You tell the silence about the things you saw today, the traffic, the rain, the coffee that was too bitter, the song that came on in the car and struck you with such sudden force that you had to pull over, because the body can only carry so much memory at once. You would have laughed at this if you were here. That sentence. You use it often enough. You would have laughed at this. You would have hated this meal. You would have rolled your eyes at this story. You would have known exactly what to say. Every dead person becomes, in the mind of the living, a perfect audience. They never interrupt. They never forget. They never leave the room. In death, we turn them into mirrors for our own unfinished feelings. The cruelest thing is that the number still exists. It is not gone. That would be easier. It still lives in the architecture of the world, hidden inside circuits and databases and invisible systems that keep a place for the dead, until time or neglect finally erases them too. The line remains somewhere, waiting for a signal it will never receive. And each time you call, you are not just trying to reach a person. You are testing whether the universe has any remaining respect for continuity, whether something can still be retrieved, whether love can cross the border that death claims as its own. It cannot. You already know that. But knowledge is not the same thing as acceptance. The body learns the truth much later than the mind. There is a phase in grief where every object becomes a witness. The chair they used to sit in, the scarf still hanging by the door, the old voicemail you refused to delete because the sound of their voice, even compressed and damaged by technology, feels more real than the empty room around you. Sometimes you play it back, just to remember the exact pitch of their laughter. Sometimes you hate yourself for doing it. Sometimes you forgive yourself, because there is no one left who can truly understand what it means to preserve a voice like that, as if holding it in digital amber might somehow keep the loss from rotting. But the voice does not return. It only repeats. And repetition, when stripped of hope, becomes a kind of pain with structure. you begin to notice things you never noticed before. The weight of your own breathing when you wait for an answer, the small tremor in your wrist, the way the room sounds different after you hang up. There is a special silence after an unanswered call. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of rejection without malice. The silence of a door that has been removed from its frame. It does not slam. It simply ceases to be a door. And yet, something in you keeps standing there. Why? Because love is not always noble. Sometimes it is just persistent. Sometimes it is the part of you that refuses to accept the final shape of a wound. It keeps touching the edge, thinking it might have healed overnight, thinking the pain might have changed its mind. And every time, it is not. Every time, the same absence. Every time, the same clean and merciless truth. Still, you call. Not because it changes anything, because it changes you a little each time. It teaches you the strange discipline of returning to an emptiness that cannot be filled. It teaches you how to carry what cannot be fixed. It teaches you that some relationships do not end when the person dies. They evolve into an interior weather, a climate, a private season that never fully leaves. You do not move on from that. You move through it, again and again, until the shape of your own life is altered by the crossing. And then, much later, something shifts. Not suddenly, never suddenly. The dead do not grant dramatic epiphanies. They are far too quiet for that. One day, perhaps after 1,000 calls, perhaps after one more than you can count, you realize the number is no longer a doorway. It is a monument. You have been calling not to hear a response, but to keep the memory of response alive inside yourself. To preserve the fact that this number once meant presence, once meant warmth, once meant a life that could answer. And maybe that is enough. Maybe that is all grief ever wanted from you. Not forgetting, not erasing, not pretending the wound never existed, but learning how to hold the absence without trying to force it back into a body. So you stop calling as often, not because you have healed. Healing is too clean a word for what actually happens. You simply begin to understand that the silence is not waiting to be defeated. It is waiting to be honored. The number remains in your phone. You leave it there, not as a mistake, not as a weakness, as an archive. Because some people do not leave behind houses or money or names carved into stone. Some leave behind the sound of a ringtone that can never again complete its journey. Some leave behind a number that does not answer and still manages somehow to keep speaking, not in words, but in weight, in absence, in the shape of the life that continued after they were gone. And maybe that is the true meaning of the call. Not to reach them, but to remember that there was once someone worth reaching. So, if tonight you find your hand moving toward that familiar number, do it gently. Let the silence answer. Let it be what it is, not punishment, not failure, just the final proof that some echoes do not fade because they are loud. They fade because they were loved. And love, when it loses its voice, does not disappear. It becomes a number that never answers and somehow still, against every law of the living, keeps ringing inside you.